I'm Ulka Anjaria, faculty here in the English department, and I'd like to cordially welcome you to our 5th lecture in the Soli Sorabjee Lecture series in South Asian Studies at Brandeis. Today we have a highly distinguished speaker, Professor Vijay Prashad, George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. We are thrilled to have him here with us today. Before I embark on the intimidating feat of introducing Vijay Prashad, a bit of background on the Soli Sorabjee Lecture series at Brandeis. The series aims to engage with themes of justice, broadly conceived. And I say broadly conceived because we are interested not only in justice as it is defined by and in legal and juridical discourses, but in larger fields of humanistic inquiry, which shed new light not only on what justice is, but what it has the potential to be. The series is named after the Honorable Soli Sorabjee, former Attorney General of India and a leading advocate of social justice. It was inaugurated last year in an attempt to bring exciting work being done in the scholarly and artistic world of South Asia and South Asian studies to Brandeis University. Last year, we hosted Harvard Professor of History Sugata Bose and Paramita Vora, innovative documentary filmmaker from Mumbai. We were also fortunate enough to host the Honorable Soli Sorabjee himself, who spoke on the moral imperative for the rule of law in post-colonial India. We kicked off our second year of the series with a visit from film professor Corey Creekmore from the University of Iowa, who spoke about the way popular Hindi film uses formal interruptions, pastiche, editing, mix of historical and stage scenes to consider the contested history of post-partition India. This range of speakers demonstrates the breadth of the way we have defined justice in what we feel is a fitting representation of the intellectual richness of South Asian studies. However, it is also important to remember that social justice is not just a metaphor or a shorthand for everything good in the arts and sciences, but also represents a particular mode of engagement with the world that is deeply committed in its intellectual praxis to contributing to knowledge and to policy, to expanding audiences beyond the ivory towers, and to contributing to righting some of the world's most grievous wrongs. Such work is often richly theoretical, but not merely theoretical. No one could better epitomize this than Vijay Prashad, one of the few remaining truly public intellectuals in the US Academy today. And when I say public intellectual, I don't mean someone whose theoretical concepts merely inform how we think about politics, but one who is actually committed to moving outside the rarefied environs of academia to engage with and in the public realm. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me properly introduce him. I first encountered Vijay Prashad's work when I read his book, The Karma of Brown Folk, published in 2000. The book, whose title plays with the title of W.E.B. Du Bois's groundbreaking 1903 work, investigates the implications of South Asian immigration to the U.S. in the context of a larger racial landscape. He shows how South Asians have both implicitly and explicitly furthered the idea of black folk as the problem by presenting brown folk as the solution to America's disparate social landscape. Besides for the important move of radically disaggregating the hegemonic discourse of US multiculturalism, which claims that all racial minorities are accepted based on the degree of their commitment to personal advancement, what struck me about this book when I first read it was the way in which Prashad brought the theoretical concern of South Asian Americans outside of the charismatic discourse of diaspora, in which South Asia remains the center and the diaspora the peripheries, onto the very different landscape of US racial politics. It might sound like an obvious point, but changing the center of focus for the study of the South Asian diaspora from South Asians abroad, which has the effect of valorizing them as a group which by its very nature is transgressive, rupturing the boundaries of the nation state, to immigrants in America, which puts them in dialogue with the multifarious racial inequalities of the US, radically alters the political and theoretical significance of this diasporic community. Along with The Karma of Brown Folk, Prashad is the author of 10 other scholarly books, and that's no small feat. When you see him, you'll see he's not that old. Most recently, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. He has also authored more than 50 journal articles, and in addition to that, at least 20 articles a year in public sphere journals, such as Frontline, Counterpunch, Economic and Political Weekly, and ZNet. The other day I was listening to Democracy Now! Coverage of the uprisings in Egypt and was pleasantly surprised to hear Prashad as a guest on the show, invited to speak about U.S. Middle East envoy Frank Wisner's close relationship with Hosni Mubarak. This is not the image of a historian nose deep in books secluded in the archive, but rather of an active participant in history in the making, the kind of intellectual for whom the radically renewing forces of history are not a deterrent to his task, but an inspiration for it. He does also work in the archive, and his historical writings on Afro-Asian connections, Dalits or untouchables, and the histories of capitalism and imperialism have made significant intellectual impact. He graduated with a doctorate in history from the University of Chicago and has taught at Syracuse, Cornell, NYU, and now at Trinity College. He teaches courses on Gandhi, on nationalism, histories of the global South, along with his expertise in South Asian history. For the sake of time, I can't go into all of Professor Prashad's intellectual accomplishments. I would probably take up all the time we have allotted for this talk. What I can say is that it is truly an inspiration to have with us an intellectual who reminds us that the age of political engagement is not dead, not some bygone relic of an older, less jaded time, but in fact is even more important today, when the push to retain our relevance as academics in the face of casualization, neoliberalism, and the constriction of higher education are making most of us feel more constrained and more cautious in our everyday intellectual undertakings. We are thrilled to be able to invite Professor Prashad to Brandeis as part of the Soli Sorabjee Lecture Series, sponsored by the Brandeis India Initiative. The Brandeis India Initiative has seen huge growth since its founding in 2007. We have just launched a new fellowship program for undergraduates interested in going to India and building ties between Brandeis and Indian alumni, partners, and organizations in the form of summer internships, study abroad, or other research programs. And there's information about Brandeis India Initiative and the fellowship at the back of the room. Besides Brandeis India, I want to thank the Modi family for their very generous funding of the series. I also want to thank the American Studies program for their co-sponsorship of the event, especially Joyce Antler and Shilpa Dave. I would also like to thank Brian McAllister Grand at the Office of Global Affairs for all his help, and William Lodge, our highly competent student assistant who has done most of the organizing for the event. So, with no more ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Vijay Prashad, for his talk, The Day the Probation Ended.
Okay. Well, first, thank you, Alka, for inviting me to come and embarrass you and embarrass the entire lecture series that you've so assiduously built. It's lovely to see Shilpa again, and surprised to see Govind from McGraw Hall at Cornell, and nice to see Sarah. These are old friends, different parts of my life come together. So, the day our probation ended. 11 days after 9/11, I was on the train to New York City. It was a Friday. I was teaching a class at New York University on immigration. I hadn't been into the city since before the attacks. Trying to distract myself, I read Saskia Sassen's Guests and Aliens. It was going to be one of the main books for our seminar. Along the way, I can't remember when, a troop of policemen came onto the train. The train was at a station. They asked various people to follow them onto the platform. I was among them. We were asked some basic questions and then told to get back on the train. I've seen enough World War II films to know how I should feel. There was fear and there was anxiety. Would I, like so many others, be sent off to a deportation detention center? News reports of such removals had begun to sneak around like a fetid rumor among South Asian Americans. A Sikh man had already been killed in Arizona. Mistaken identity was the order of the day. My conversation with the officer was brief. He asked me what I was reading. It seemed that even a nonconformist book in English was sufficient to prove my academic credentials. No disrespect to Saskia Sassen, but a dog-eared and marked-up copy of her book would hardly be in the hands of a terrorist. That was, of course, wishful thinking. On October 29th, Tariq Ali was detained in Munich. The offending article, a slim volume in German, Karl Marx on suicide. Tariq had the mayor of Munich stand in as surety for him. As he wrote that day, it was a tiny enough scratch, but if untreated, these can sometimes lead to gangrene. The ethnic newspapers carried reports of more serious incidents. The mass arrests in the tri-state area, the development of the special registration program, and the sense of discomfort that more such arrests would come and we would have to suffer something like internment. The I word had come up even among politicians. It was not all fantasy. The irony in all this was that among the hijackers, none were from South Asia. They were Saudis and Egyptians and seemed to have spent most of their time in Europe, with only a brief detour for some in Afghanistan. Anthropological and geopolitical distinctions seemed to make no difference. It was sufficient if you resembled a terrorist. Olive skin, turbans, headscarves, facial hair, and other such tokens were the markers of danger. It is why Sikh men came into the dragnet early. Osama bin Laden also wears a turban. None of the hijackers wore turbans or had outward signs of religiosity. A terrorist does not announce himself or herself. That would defeat the purpose. But the visual sign is precisely what the racist would like to focus on, exactly what the terrorist would like to deny. The bodies of so many were stripped bare by this contradiction. The reaction inside Indian America and South Asian America reflected the limitations of our histories. It is through these histories and our locations within them that we can best understand the kind of responses to the post-9/11 period. It is also in our engagement with these histories that we can clarify the changes in our own understanding of ethnicity and politics, immigration and terror. Part 1, Twice-Born Generation. My brother moved to California in the 1980s, and I followed along. He worked in San Leandro, a town devoted to the maintenance of cars and car culture. On the weekend, the Indian American community would gather in each other's homes. The people in the room were warm and friendly, with the men in one room, the women in another, and the children in the basement or the den, with their, as they call them, home friends. I was too old to be with the kids, most of whom were born in the United States, and too young to mingle freely with the adults. That curious age allows one to wander between sets. I remain enthralled by two facts about these adults. First, that they were all highly educated men and women who held various kinds of professional jobs in their new country. Not more than a decade in their new land, they had already attained positions of prominence in their fields. Not as leaders, to be sure, but as accomplished technicians, as doctors, engineers, scientists, and even in the less sure world of mid-range business. Second, that they had almost no interest in politics or in the issues of the day. No one much like Reagan, but that seemed largely a temperamental thing. His casualness seemed inappropriate for a world leader. If the discussion turned to politics, it was most often about India. And here too, the trend seems staged. Either nostalgia for the kind of political talk of their college days, or animosity for this or that policy of the government. The textbook was India West and India Abroad, the newspapers of record for the Indian American community. Occasionally, there was a bit of guilt about leaving India behind, to be part of the brain drain. This led to the very rare bout of collective charity, to raise money for this or that orphanage, or school of the blind, or earthquake relief. Nearby Oakland burned with the futility of the modern world, but it would only come into our conversation if talk turned to the vegetables to be found at its Chinatown. Nothing of this should come as a surprise. The middle class in general seeks convenience and is loath to turn to politics when it might inconvenience one's daily life or one's sense of moral equilibrium. That's a universally enforced silence. Nor should it come as a surprise that the migrants who come to the United States after 1965 have no well-developed social obligation to the struggles that enabled them to have such success. The road to Indian America was paved by the struggles of others, now barely acknowledged. Born in the 1940s and 1950s, this generation of middle-class Indians missed the Indian freedom struggle. Some of them would have had parents or grandparents in the fight, but they themselves did not lift the cudgels for their homeland. When they went to school and college, now funded by the hard labor of their co-citizens in the new nation, they did not feel the weight of subordination and exclusion. It was a privilege to breathe the air of freedom and to feel part of a new dawn. That is the first birth, of those who would become Indian Americans. Remember, this section is called twice born, so their first birth. The second birth is equal to the first. The United States barred Indians from entry into the country between 1924 and 1965. The law changed in 1965 as a result of the United States' fear of that the Soviets might overtake it in the science, technology, and arms race. The Soviet rocket Sputnik in 1957 sent fear into the spinal cord of the nation. The new immigration law allowed migrants to enter if they brought with them special technical and scientific skills as well as medical degrees, this to help staff the expanded Medicare systems also in operation from the mid-1960s. This was the reason why I was surrounded by doctors and engineers on those Friday nights. But the Immigration Act also came alongside two landmark laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At least two generations of people sacrificed their lives and longings to overturn the injustice of Jim Crow. Because of that struggle, the new migrants who entered the universities and laboratories, hospitals and research centers could live with the formal promise of equality. Once more, the air of freedom and of a new beginning. Indian Americans did not know political struggles for freedom. In India, they were born after independence had been won, and in the United States, they arrived after the civil rights struggle already won them dignity and rights. This doubly privileged section also had the incredible fortune of state-supported education and state-selected immigration practices to give them the feeling that they were invincible. The massive social network that delivered them their advantages was invisible to them. Their blindness to their twice-born status was helped along by the US establishment media that championed them as a model minority, one who did not need welfare and overt state support. And it was also helped along by the Indian establishment, which by the 1980s celebrated their overseas success and longed for their surplus investments. Better brain drain, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi said, than brain in the drain. Part 2, Race and the Birth of the South Asian American. At those weekend parties, I would eat with the children. My task was to make sure that they didn't spill their drinks on the sofas and they would eat at least something without too much complaint. It was not an unpleasant task. They had much to offer in entertainment, naughty in the way of migrant children, thrown together, some related and some not, feeling comfortable in their skin among children who had similar parents and similar schoolmates. Two worlds that otherwise wouldn't know each other, but familiar to all of them. Of course, I was eager to be elsewhere. Too old for this, but with neither the cash nor the car to cry havoc in the world of my peers. Poor me. Years later, as a community organizer in Providence, Rhode Island, I met the peers of these children, now college students in their own right. I was running a campaign against tobacco advertisements in the areas of the poor, neighborhoods mainly populated by African Americans, Dominican Americans, and Hmong Americans. We got a spot on our local television channel. The next morning, I got a phone call from a student at Brown University. She was a representative, she told me, of the South Asian Students Association, and they wanted to see about doing some community service. A few days later, the SASA Executive Board came to see me on Lockwood Avenue. And imagine, I worked at a community organization in the heart of Providence, and these two fancy cars drive in, and all the doors open, like as if it's an FBI raid, and out of them pours about 50 South Asian American students from each car, all extremely formally dressed for a meeting with me, dressed very poorly, in my shabby office. Okay, they were nervous about being in this part of town, but eager to be involved. Everything about them moved me. The memories of the childhood of young adults like them in far-off California, and the reality that they wanted to devote some of their energy to matters far removed from their own lives and ambitions. Born in largely white suburbs, these young people also gathered on weekends to meet the children of immigrants like their parents. But they had been otherwise isolated from their parents' homelands. The occasional summer trip didn't mark their lives. They came of age on the wave of multiculturalism, which in the affluent and modest suburbs meant a great deal of tolerance for the educated migrant. It would all change a generation later when the migrants into the suburbs and exurbs were the working class Latinos. It was already difficult when the entrant was African or African American. The hierarchies of racial acceptance cushioned the Indians and their families. There are always the anecdotes of humiliation, but these were not central. When these young people went to college in the 1990s, a new form of racial belonging emerged. They became South Asian American, a term that doesn't refer to a place, South Asia, but to a sense of community amongst children of parents from the various countries of South Asia. These parents might not have that much in common. Sri Lankans would not necessarily meet socially with Pakistanis, but their children saw the connection intuitively. The content of their cultural lives might have been different, but the form was similar. South Asian parents, with their own robust connections to their homeland and their own, sometimes anachronistic ideas about raising children, and American schools and friends on the other side with their own worldviews and expectations. It was this duality that was shared across these students. Scholar Sunaina Myra cleverly called this process reverse assimilation. The cultural links were the subjective connection. The other half, the objective basis for the emergence of the South Asian American, was the nature of social life on college campuses. College multiculturalism operated on the basis of a binary. There were the so-called normal students whose social life was already well provided for. And there were those other students who came from previously invisible populations. African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, some colleges women, lesbians and gays, and international students. To bring these students to life, the colleges and universities provided funds for organizations and events. It is in this space that the children of the Indian migrants found their association with children of migrants from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. There was often a minor struggle to gain a foothold in the Asian American organization, but that was not always serious. Most students created the equivalent of SASA, South Asian American Students Association. By 1989, the most energetic SASA organizations joined together to create an annual SASA conference, typically held in January. I first went to a SASA conference in 1996. Among the organizers were those who had come to seek me out 3 years previously. We had worked together on various projects, and they had been to some protests in downtown Providence. It was an education for all of us. For the SASA in 1996, they invited Urvashi Vaid, a leading voice in the gay and lesbian movement, as the keynote speaker. It was a singular choice. Unlikely that their parents would ever have chosen Urvashi to keynote one of the community events. That political gulf between the parents and the children could not have been any wider. The contradictions of social life on American campuses and the contradictions of American society had clarified many things for the South Asian Americans. The panels at SASA covered such themes as racism, sexism, homophobia, the role of religion, the place of the university, and so on. At one level, this could have been a Black students' conference or a Latino-Latina students' conference. The themes covered were the same, if the analysis and the context were different. Certainly, one should not be too rosy-eyed in this narrative. Many of those who worked in SASA or around it found ethnicity to be a viable platform for social mobility. SASA morphed for the graduates into the network of Indian or South Asian professionals. Even the national SASA had its downfall by 2003, when the students lost control of it to the party promoters, such as Intense Entertainment. Dharmesh Patel, who co-organized SASA at Dallas in 2000, told me a few years after that, the party promoters focus on profits, skimp on security, and truly undermine the original intent of the conference. The ideology of multiculturalism does allow ethnicity to be used to build a resume and to incorporate talented people from the hitherto disparaged communities into the upper reaches of society. But that's not the whole story. By the 1990s, as these young people left college, it was hard to walk into a non-profit organization anywhere in the United States and not find a South Asian American on the staff. It was equally difficult to find a civil rights legal office without a South Asian American. Taking the best of their advantages, and unlike many of their parents, they threw themselves into the wider political world. After all, unlike their parents, they were American and not always immigrants. And again, unlike their parents, they had lived the contradictions of coming of age in the United States. No privilege without recognition for most of them. But the children of 1965 had antecedents for this category, South Asian American. By the mid-1980s, South Asian women from New Jersey to the Bay Area formed organizations to take charge of an unmentioned violence against women and children. From Manavi to Narika, these organizations did not wish to associate themselves with the mainstream cultures of the subcontinent that promoted patriarchy as routine. To push against cruel cultural nationalism, these groups had separately from the college associations begun to use the term South Asian American. It was a term that would be adopted by South Asian American gay and lesbian organizations, as well as by culturally and politically progressive groups that took a pan-ethnic approach. Pan-ethnic groups, scholar Yen Lee Espiritu wrote in 1994, are products of political and social processes rather than cultural bonds. These often emerge, she argues, to contest systems of racism and inequality in American society. In this case, they emerge to contest systems of patriarchy and homophobia within the cultural world of the migrants. The pathway to South Asian America for the young college graduates in the 1990s was paved by these pioneers, who set up space in the activist and non-profit world for struggle in general, and now struggle as South Asian Americans. Part 3. There are only, I think, 4 parts. After 9/11. Before 9/11 was 1993, when Ramzi Yousef and his Confederates bombed the World Trade Center that year. A very gentle tremor of fear spread through the communities of those who might resemble terrorists. When I was in college in the 1980s, a few unimaginative acquaintances would occasionally call me, and I know it's unfortunate for the present, but they would call me Gaddafi. He was in the news a lot in that decade, having been a burr under Reagan's saddle. People like me had the misfortune of looking like your average terrorist. I had a long pseudo-afro in the 1980s, which provided the Gaddafi look, and by the 1990s, the shorter hair look that was au courant among the terrorists who came from the Gulf. So I've had 2, maybe 3 bad hair decades. The general sentiment among Indian Americans was dismay. Racism against the olive-skinned had begun to rise. This is reflected in the annual audits of the National Asian American Pacific Legal Consortium. By 1998, 32% of all assaults on Asian Americans took place against South Asians, compared to about 4.5% in 1995. Inside the Indian American community, which I knew best of all, the reactions were diverse. Some had taken refuge in an idea that traveled to them from India. The hardened Hindutva or Hindu right was at the high point of its campaign to transform Indian society from secularism to sectarianism, with the Muslim as the target. Drawing from this trend, some among the Indian Americans tried to make the case that they were Hindus and not Muslims. They wanted a get-out-of-jail card. Others dug deep into their own careers and lives, hoping against hope that this tide too would settle. And a few others began a conversation about profiling, linking the acute problem of racial profiling against blacks and Latinos by the police departments as agents of the state to the racial profiling against those who look like terrorists, here not by the state, but by society. These strategies provided respite, even if they ended up creating fissures between Hindus and Muslims. But they were not a sufficient respite. The bombing of the Oklahoma building by white supremacists was no comfort to the Indian Americans. The first reaction was that this was an act of violence by those who should be terrorists, and terrorists defined narrowly. Jim Stewart at CBS heard the news and went on the air to proclaim, "The betting here is on Middle East terrorists." It turned out that this was more Midwest than Mideast, but that didn't stop the pundits. A.M. Rosenthal of the New York Times insisted, "Whatever we are doing to destroy Mideast terrorism, the chief terrorist threat against Americans has not been working." I remember a second sense of panic. The backlash was on the horizon. It would come 6 years later. Nothing about 9/11 is easy to explain. There is, of course, the immense tragedy. There is also the geopolitical narrative of US military extension from the Hindu Kush to the empty quarter, of discontent for US economic and military support to both Israel and Egypt. There is, in addition, the aftermath, the moral panic within the United States that led to two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, a wild foreign policy that led to the emergence of two nuclear powers, North Korea and Iran, and the alarm that produced the state's overreach, the special registration program, the prosecution of charities even remotely linked to terrorist groups, the FBI informant-driven arrests, and so on. As well, society's animosities, the fears of those who look like terrorists, and the killing of those who look like terrorists. In this miserable space, those Indian Americans who had taken refuge in Hindutva, or the Hindu right, now sought out allies in their further disavowal of Islam and Muslims. Some of them forged close ties with groups such as the American Jewish Community and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They formed the group that would become US INPAC and has some place in Washington, D.C. But they remain a minority, isolated in their biliousness. The majority dug deep, trying to camouflage their outward signs in patriotism. A Washington Post journalist came to visit a Sikh community leader in Washington, D.C., who told her, "We condemn harassment, we condemn terrorism, we are American, and we fully support the Bush administration." One of his nephews had just been shot at because he wore a turban. "We are united as Sikhs," the community leader told the reporter, "and as Americans." Patriotism was not, in this instance, the refuge of scoundrels. It was an act of desperation. The sharp edge of 9/11 racism brought many among the migrants toward the politics of the South Asian Americans. They took refuge in the organizations created by their children, groups that had previously created strong connections with the civil rights and civil liberties communities. Founded in 2000, South Asian American Leaders of Tomorrow, or SALT, was formed to develop leadership among the community with the intention to move young people into mainstream American politics. 9/11 changed SALT. It began to do documentary work on anti-South Asian violence in the United States, making connections with the Muslim and Arab organizations, as well as East Asian organizations, whose own history regarding internment had brought them into the picture. SALT produced two important documents to catalog the violence and the sense of despondency and fear. A report of the violence, American Backlash, Terrorists Bring War Home in More Ways Than One, from 2001, and a video of Community Talking Back, the Community Talking Back, Raising Our Voices, South Asian Americans Address Hate, 2002. This was a genuine shift, bringing older and younger people into a political project to address the overt and covert violence. Over the course of the decade, SALT changed its name to better reflect its new agenda, South Asian Americans Leading Together. And they formed the National Coalition of South Asian Organizations. Its members include the old South Asian women's organizations, Narika, Manavi, Sakhi, and the organizations formed in the aftermath of 9/11, the Sikh Coalition, as well as the more youth and community organizations with an eye to more radical action, Desis Rising Up and Moving, and the South Asian Network. The political landscape had changed dramatically from the 1990s. One becomes a part of the fabric of a country by being a part of its struggles, to make sure that its putative values do not ossify. Belonging to anything does not come without a fight. Part 4, long-distance solidarity. And it'll open with a little poem from Gadar Di Gunj, 1914. The world derisively accosts us, O coolie, we have no fluttering flag of our own. Our home is on fire. Why don't we rise up and extinguish it? Abject subjects of the British Empire, the overseas Indians in the 1910s recognized at least that they would not be treated as human beings as long as their homelands remained in bondage. That was established by the emergence of the Gadar Party in Stockton, California in 1913. By the way, they inaugurate Indian nationalism in California before Gandhi returns from South Africa, where he learned how to be an Indian. Gandhi, when he left Gujarat, was not really much of an Indian. He learns how to be an Indian in South Africa and goes back after the Ghadar party had already called for independence in Stockton, California. 10 years before the Indian National Congress will announce its aims of complete independence. Okay. That was established by the emergence of the Ghadar party in Stockton, California in 1913. They knew that there was a link between their own social standing and social identity and that of the foreign policy of the state in which they lived. The United States government and its people would regard Indians as coolies as long as the British had dominion over South Asia. It is this link between foreign policy and social life that has not held fast over the century. Today, many migrants believe that they can simply walk away from their homeland and rebuild their lives and identities in their new lands. This is simply not possible. The miasma of international relations interrupts our lives constantly. The concord between the generations has emerged slowly but surely in the world of US domestic politics. But there is no such mass platform to engage with the dilemmas of international relations. Some of this has to do with the differential state interests in South Asia, with those from India perhaps unwilling to take the view of those from Pakistan and vice versa. Such distinctions make it hard to even hold a bare minimum common understanding of the problem in South Asia and in the region around. Nor is there much agreement on the causes of terrorism, as Dick Cheney's maxim, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, remains alive and well. Imputed disagreements such as these make most organizations afraid to even try to forge a common understanding. Why start something that you think is fated to fail? Over the years, I've been involved with various efforts to create South Asian peace initiatives in the United States, as well as South Asian-led discussions on economic and political violence. The former, the peace initiatives, have indeed come to no good end. When it comes to foreign policy, particularly India-Pakistan relations, the temperature is not salubrious and has never been so. And it's worse across generations. There have been occasional signs, such as during the 1998 taxi strike in New York, which took place in the shadow of the nuclear tests in 1998 between India and Pakistan. Not one taxi driver that I met during the day of the strike, when 23,000 of the 24,000 taxi drivers went on strike, not one taxi driver that I met in the shadow of this nuclear test wanted to touch the nuclear issue. Very clear that their solidarity in New York was far more important than the disagreements across the border in South Asia. Some of this was pragmatic. Don't let the nuclear test disrupt the taxi worker unity. But pragmatism is often a good place to begin a difficult conversation. Frequent convulsions on the border, at the time the ongoing civil war in Sri Lanka, violence in Bangladesh, and the rise of far-right politics in the region, far-right politics of religion in the region, hamper any attempt at dialogue. Discussions on political and economic violence have also been vilified for being outdated. If the Ghadar militants wanted India to be free for their dignity, the Indian Americans of the 1990s and early 2000s wanted the Indian economy to shine as a way to be a proud Indian. Any talk of poverty or agrarian collapse rubbed against this tendency. It meant, of course, that one could not have a serious discussion about the rise of the political right, which has rested its claims on the dissatisfaction of the bulk of the population, now twisted away from their exploitation toward the belief that the path to a full belly is through the mosque or the temple. No real consideration of terrorist violence is possible without a serious conversation about the kind of economic policy pushed by the many Indians and Indian Americans who work at places like the World Bank, the IMF, Goldman Sachs, Pfizer, Pepsi, and so on. 9/11 is all about foreign policy. Its aftermath inside the United States affected Desis, South Asians and South Asian Americans and Indian Americans, who then forged responses of various kinds to racism and profiling. Little was done toward the root problem, the exertion of US power into the lands that stretch from the Western Sahara to the Philippines. 9/11 racism is a symptom of a much deeper problem. Neither the Indian Americans nor the South Asian Americans seem prepared to deal with that much more difficult, much graver issue, the overreach of American power into the Asiatic heartland. We've been able to acknowledge the hurdle of race. The next hurdle is imperialism. If we don't see it and work on it, racism, a consequence of imperialism, will persist. That is the message of Gadar, and it resonates. Thank you so much. Please ask me questions, yeah. You want to stand up to the mic, so I don't know, there's a mic there. It might be important since it's there.
Okay, near the end you linked racism and imperialism, and I found that very interesting. I think I probably agree with it. I would have to think about it more, but you said that imperialism is a cause of racism, and I think they're definitely linked, but I'm not sure if one is the cause of the other, or the other is the cause of the first one, or they're both the cause of some other third factor. And do you think that's possible, really?
You mean to identify the arrow?
Yes.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question. It's an important question. It also depends what you mean by racism and imperialism. And so what I mean by racism, of course, is scientific modern racism that will develop in the 19th century, which has, I think, deep roots in the explorations of the rest of the world where new knowledge comes in, you know. But I think that, for instance, the period of high imperialism in the late 19th century, when you really have what I consider to be imperialism, that imperialism is motivated by a policy informed by ideas of race, for sure. But it's in imperialism that racism will snowball. You know, for instance, if you read Orinoco, a great narrative from when? 17th century? Somebody help me. Orinoco, Afraben, 17th century? The vision there of Africans is quite different than the vision one would have after the partition of Africa, after the slave trade, etc. After the slave trade becomes that mechanized kind of thing, you know. So I think these things are happening simultaneously, but my feeling is after the late 19th century, you know, when these two processes move on, I think imperialism is the driver of raciology, racial thinking, etc. They may have separate and mutual origins, and they may move against each other, but after the 19th century, I think imperialism is driving the car. And I know that in the contemporary period, when people like, in contemporary means the last 100 years, when the Gadar movement suggests, for instance, we will never be free until the homeland is free. You know, if imperialism is always going to see us as people who can be subordinated, we will never be able to articulate freedom. You know, we will never be able to walk outside racism. So I feel like they may have separate and mutual origins, but after the 19th century, imperialism is the dependent variable there. And again, it depends what you mean by racism. If you mean racism is like prejudice, that's something different. I'm not talking about simple prejudice, you know, xenophobia or disregard for others, because those things have complicated and much longer histories. I mean, for instance, the way we create structurally disposable populations in the United States, you know, that link is to economic and political policy. You know, why are cities disposed of? Why are large sections of the population irrelevant? That they can be rendered either policed in the open air or policed in jails. You know, why are mainly African American and certain Latino populations outside the regime of accumulation of capital? You know, they have become disposable. And so the economic and political processes of international relations, imperialism, has a marked impact on racial formations. So I would say after the late 19th century, imperialism drives the car. Yes, please, but you'll have to come because they've organized this.
An obstacle course here.
Yeah, sorry. I don't need the mic because it's a nice room, beautiful room.
Thank you so much for the talk.
Please.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit also about the minority status of Muslims and Sikhs in India and South Asia. It seems interesting that, you know, you've talked about the emergence of the Muslims and the Sikhs as this targeted minority in the United States after 9/11, but it seems to me that it closely mirrors political discourse in South Asia as well. And I'm wondering if you could connect those two rising fundamentalisms for us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, of course they have different tempos and they have a different dynamic in Indian, let's say, the Indian story of the marginalization or even construction of Muslims as danger is also a 19th century story, after the mutiny, blah, blah, blah. Let's leave the long story. What's it? Hunter, Indian Musalman. That book is written in 1871, maybe. And you get the Muslim as a dangerous enemy after the uprising of 1857, 58. So there's a long story. It has a different tempo. But by the time you get to the 1980s, there's a process that mirrors the United States. But let's just stay with India first. By the time you get to the 1980s, when the social compact of Nehruvian state policy, when the state essentially withdraws itself from even the notional idea that it's responsible for the well-being of the population, there's a big legitimacy crisis for the political parties. And all the political parties tack towards religion. I mean, before the Hindu right comes into its own, Indira Gandhi is prostrating herself full length in front of, her, what did she call him? She called him she was her guru, but she called him my light or some, word like. Anyway, but she would go and prostrate herself full length before temples, something that Nehru would never have done, and she would never have done before the 1980s. So the Congress party itself will make a massive turn towards Hindu majoritarianism. And that, of course, leads in Punjab, where there's a big debate about things like sharing water rights, a big debate about sharing Chandigarh, who gets Chandigarh, Haryana or Punjab after the partition of the two, and a major debate about agricultural subsidies, which are being cut by the state as it goes away from producing the well-being for the population. So in the mix of that, you'll get the emergence now of so-called Sikh separatism. Bhindranwale will come as a Congress proxy. He's a Congress proxy to come and sort of divert the contradictions in Punjab, and then the proxy will become the beast itself. It's a very similar story to, say, the role of the Mehman Mujahideen, who are sent by the grace of the Saudi regime and the Americans to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that Mehman Mujahideen will then become the major anti-American force. In the same way, Bhindranwale was sent into Punjab to essentially divert the Sikh Student Federation and others, and then he becomes the problem. So the Sikh as a problem emerges in the early 1980s, and then when the BJP takes up space by the late 1980s, the Muslim becomes the problem. And those constructions come largely when the state withdraws completely from its idea that its role in life is to provide the well-being of the population. And in that sense, neoliberalism will become the engine of a new kind of anti-minority politics. And in the United States, it's slightly different, because here I would suggest that when the when Fordism and the factories close down, populations become disposable here more than in India. In India, the informal sector is much larger anyway. It has a different tempo. But here you get the black population, Latinos and others, the whole prison thing comes in. In India, it's not in prison, it becomes terrorist. The Muslim and Sikh become terrorists. In the United States, the disposable population become prisoners in one way or the other, or dangerous, criminals. So under Clinton's regime, you get the 1994 crime bill, which will take the Rockefeller laws and ratchet them up one more degree, and you have a huge second spike in incarceration rates, police increases. So as social welfare spending will decrease, you have an increase in the security state. That's the link between the two societies, that social welfare decreases, or the commitment to the population, and the security state rises. And the security state is what we live in today. I mean, we don't live in a state that is committed to the population. We live in security states. These are states that are committed to finance capital and have rendered their services largely to securing gated communities from the rest of the population. And that is, I think, that's how I see the similar structure, but the tempos are different. I would prefer not to live in a security state, but I do feel safe from myself. Many times in the airport, I'm like, please search me in front of everybody so they don't. Have you seen the movie Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo? My favorite scene is when he looks back at that person and he looks like a Taliban and she's petrified. And remember that scene? He looks back at her. And then, of course, he goes to the bathroom and he's got his bong and they think it's a bomb. He's in Guantanamo. Come on, you had a question. Okay. So yeah, I'm like, please search me. So then you'll feel comfortable and I'll feel comfortable. Yeah.
Hi. You
Please.
spoke about how Indian and Sikh men were being pushed into this false and dangerous stereotype of terrorists or criminals based on just their looks. They had turbans, and although the turbans were thicker, as you spoke about you with the haircuts, and pushing themselves to declare Americans, that they agreed with the Bush administration, that they took all these stances. At the same time, since what role were South Asian American, Indian, Sikh women playing? Were they going along with this paradigm shift? Because I didn't know if you touched on that too much, if you could expand.
Well, it's interesting that, for instance, the populations in New Jersey where the special registration program ran, they mainly arrested the men. And they produced a scenario where the women would be outside the detention centers asking for their men to be released. But by no means were only men arrested. Section of women were arrested and deported as well. So not only men were arrested in the South Asian Muslim population. That's where the special registration hit hardest. That's where the state went into the population and removed people whose visa status was dubious. Okay? So there, some women do go, but mainly it's men. I mean, the Sikh situation, the turban, there are some Sikh women who wear turbans, but not a whole lot. That is more where not the state targeted populations, but the populations were targeted by society. They were where somebody sees somebody and says, you are a terrorist, I'm going to run you over in the car. And there were many reports of South Asian women dressed in, say, salwar kameez or something in a grocery store. There's one quite funny story about a woman with a shopping cart in a grocery store. This is in one of the SALT reports. And she's pushing, and a car keeps trying to run her over. She keeps running in between cars, and it's almost comical. Like, what were you thinking, trying to run over somebody with a grocery cart in the grocery store parking lot? But that's the level of, I would say it's a sort of deranged idea that this person is a terrorist, I have to run them over. I'm not sure if that's the best thing you do when you confront a terrorist anyways, try to run them over with your car, because they may have a bomb or, and you don't want to go near them, you like to flee. So there were targeted attacks. But, one thing about the way the state acts against populations it targets, it genders the whole thing immediately. It makes women into the victims who are crying for the husband and the husband in jail or the son in jail. And the way that worked is that you had, like the mothers of the plaza, you had many women get very, very politically active and organized. So Desis Rising Up and Moving became largely, what Desis Rising Up and Moving did was inside the detention centers, they put phone numbers, 800 numbers, so you could call out, the detainee could call out. And they wanted to find out who's in the jail, because nobody knew who was in detention. People were just being taken in. So you could call out and say, I am in detention. So they put 800 numbers. And people manning the phones, many of them were women whose family members had been taken in, and they were radicalized in that process. So that's some of the ways in which these processes took place. Please, yeah. Oh, you can stay from there. I don't care. Please. Yeah.
I have learned this right now, so.
Please, yeah, fine.
It's there.
Yeah.
This is a kind of minor question. I just wanted you to help me understand something better, because your answer to the first question was, in part, it depends what you mean by racism.
Yes.
And then you gave a systematic definition of racism that fundamentally as a way, a system of making certain populations disposable, right. And not part of that which is represented by the benefit to which the state is supposedly addressed. So what, and yet there seems to be something systematic about the troubled situation of Indians in this country, for instance, after 9/11. But they aren't good examples of what you were talking about as people who have been sort of localized in inner cities, in prisons, and so on, or in failing cities, and made disposable in a kind of structural way. So what, do you think it's xenophobia, in fact, that has linked all people of olive skin in the expansion of racism after 9/11, or do you think, or can you talk more about racism in such a way as to include South Indians?
Yes, very good question. I think that I would say that it's xenophobia because it peaked and then it disappeared largely. You know, after a few years there was embarrassment. You know, like in airports, people feel embarrassed. And I think even the security, they'll take other people. I've often stood in a queue and said, please take me, and they'll take the person after me. And they'll, you know, and I'm like, me, not this person with 3 children and, you know, harassed, and please let me substitute myself. Okay? So after a certain point, it began to dissipate. And that's why I think it was xenophobia. It's not structural. But the analysis that I have is this xenophobia will continue to appear it'll be punctuated at certain periods because there is a fundamental thing that has not been dealt with. That's why to be a Muslim in America is always going to be a certain kind of problem, but not always a problem. That is, you'll still have Muslims becoming doctors, heads of interfaith council, you know, maybe not allowed to build a mosque near, you know, within the vicinity of whatever. Okay, fine, all those things. But Muslims will still be able to rise. Whereas if you are from Springfield, Massachusetts, you know, maybe 0.1% of people in that elementary school class is going to have an income above $45,000. So that is systematic racism. That is the disposableness of the entire community. So I would say that with this kind of, what I'm talking about, these are episodic moments which are rooted, I would suggest, not in the domestic political economy, but in the international arena of hierarchies of different spaces. You know, so why is it that after the explosion in North Africa, I talked to a lot of my Arab and, you know, friends both there and here, and the thing that keeps coming to me is, in a sense, the revolts in North Africa are the Arab world's answer to 9/11. You know, the United States posted a letter after 9/11 saying you are a terrorist, and the Arab world has replied to the letter saying, no, we are not terrorists, we actually want democracy. So everybody here is thrilled. Why? Because now they can say, I am not Muhammad Atta, I am that Google executive. You know, so these punctuations of xenophobia are related to the hierarchies of international geography, whereas the racism is rooted in the political economy domestically.
But don't you think the hierarchies of international geography can be linked to the creation of disposable populations just earlier? Or not? I mean, isn't that what a colonial population is? It's to some degree disposable?
Yes, absolutely sure. But, you know, there are ways in which racism is the most wily fox. And so is xenophobia. It is able to shapeshift and move. The tragedy is that those of us who sometimes study these things see them as blocks. We want to define it in chapter 1 and then we sort of go along. But it continues to move. It's quicksilver. So our analysis is to keep up with it. I mean, why is it that, you know, you can have, the head of Pepsi is an Indian woman. You know, and she became the head of Pepsi after 9/11. So I'm not going to rub my hands and say, you know, we are oppressed, and I'm not interested in that. Because that's not true. After 9/11, the head of Pepsi is an Indian woman. Okay, at the same time, the guy who argued the Hamdan case, I think it's Rumsfeld versus Hamdan, right? Is Neil Katyal, who is an incredible South Asian American who loves wine. We used to write for a magazine together. He wrote the wine column. And now, of course, he's in the Obama administration defending exactly the opposite policies he fought against when he was fighting cases in front of the Supreme Court. But in that sense, I would say that these are punctuated moments that appear. And they are rooted in those geographies. And if we don't deal with those geographies, I think what we end up with is these moments of respite until the next punctuation. 1993, 9/11, and then I wait for the next one. Which is why I say, if you're Arab American, you say, phew, we have replied to that letter that the Americans sent after 9/11. Thank God. Now, please, let there not be another terrorist attack. If there is, then they have replied back to us again, and then we'll have to reply again, and what's going on here? When can we say that our telegram that we send back is the final telegram? We are interested in democracy. Some clown might do something, but we are interested in democracy. That's what that's how international geography has to change. But that's rooted in America having to come to terms with oil, America having come to terms with, we can't go and bomb Libya and save the Libyans because that's going to harden Gaddafi. That's the hierarchies of international geography. Please, yeah, I know you're...
Thank you very much. I think that was a very useful discussion of how the hierarchies of political geography affect the question of racism. I want to ask how changes are affecting this question of imperialism. And you defined racism so beautifully. I was wondering if you could define imperialism for us. Because to speak perfectly frankly, in an age when the United States stumbles along at 2.5% growth, and India races along at 10% growth, it doesn't feel, at least to your average American,
very good.
that the structures of imperialism still affect the Indian-American relationship. It feels like India has a tremendous amount of the dignity that is it Gujarat Party, the party that you mentioned in San Francisco,
the Ghadar Party,
the Ghadar Party,
yeah,
was seeking, and I'm wondering if that is legitimate,
right.
if that will change the dynamic, if there's some structure of imperialism that we don't see.
Yeah.
How that works.
That's a great question, and it's a good thing because I'm writing a book about this now it's called The Poorer Nations: A Possible History of the Global South, and it'll come out early next year. It's a follow-up from my work on the Third World, and it starts in 1973. And what I'm interested in is actually saying maybe there's no India and there's no America. When you say India has a growth rate of 9%, what are we talking about? What is America at 2%? So let's start there. Now, after 73, the way my analysis is moving, and I've written 3 chapters of 4. So right now I'm at the BRIC chapter, which is why this is a great question for me now. Yeah, exactly. So what happens is that you get this very unstable equilibrium. Capitalism is typically a turbulent process. So you get a problem with where there's, let me put it this way. Firms, I'm going to do like a basic thing. So here we go. Firms basically produce for profit. Nobody says, I want to make toothpaste because I've always wanted to make toothpaste. Some people may say that, but what makes firms all the same, what unites firms, is that they basically all work for profit. Now, there may be a firm which is working for profit, but Tom really wants to make toothpaste. Okay? That may be. But they also are working for profit. Profit is what unites firms, the activity of firms. So if they are working for profit, one of the ways, the great engine of profit, and that's the dynamism of capitalism, is to create new technologies so that you can then have a productivity edge among your competitors. But that edge is very short-lived. Competitors catch up, even out, and then there's another breakthrough. Schumpeter, Polanyi has written some of this stuff, right? You keep seeking breakthroughs. What that does is it ends up in cycles of massive overcapacity, where firms are producing way more than effective demand is available. So for instance, firms want to produce for a profit, so they're trying to suppress collectively the wage packet of workers. As they move to productivity, they bring more technology into the shop floor. That means you can have less and less workers making more and more stuff. So in terms of the population, you have sections of the population that are either underemployed or unemployed, or getting less money. So effective demand is much less than the capacity of goods. That's the big gap that capitalism has to keep managing. What typically happens is you manage that gap by 2 processes. One is advertising, so you create desire among the population for things they may not need. And the second is you create credit markets. You produce credit. So somebody is creating huge surpluses, which they then lend to the population, sometimes generously, sometimes on outrageous, usurious interest rates, and then they come and buy this surplus stuff which they desire from advertising. What has occurred is, after the 1970s, when there was turbulence in the system, and when all these kinds of, this kind of process of overcapacity, went haywire, firms were unleashed. I mean, globalization was an answer. Globalization wasn't a natural process. Globalization is an ancient thing. But this globalization was an answer to the problem of containers. The United States container had to be opened so that firms could disarticulate production to low-wage centers. What you have today is you have a global market of labor, but with differential subsistence rates. So that in America, to subsist, you need to earn this much, and in India, to subsist, you need this much. So a firm is released to go and hire people at this subsistence rate. So there is no effective global subsistence rate. There are national subsistence rates, and firms can take advantage of that. We call that politely in economics arbitrage. Okay, they can do labor arbitrage. They go from one place to the other. What's happening is that these big firms, which are rooted in the north largely, have been making massive profits, producing in the south. So it creates an illusion that, say, China has a runaway growth rate. But what is China? What is Shenzhen? Shenzhen is a special processing country, basically, where there are firms in joint venture with the Chinese government producing massive amounts of goods for which over the last 10 years they've found markets and then accumulated vast surpluses which they lent back to places like the United States where there's no productive capacity to create the effective demand so that this crazy machine can keep going. So China has a 10% growth rate, but what is China? China has higher Gini coefficients now than it had 25 years ago. So the Chinese population cannot afford to buy the stuff that's produced in Shenzhen. There's no China market. There's no effective China market. What is the BRIC country? Brazil is steaming along. Why? Because commodity prices are high. They are largely selling raw materials. So what is imperialism? Imperialism is not the same as imperialism before 1973. But it's imperialism nonetheless. It's never the case that the central country in an empire benefits everybody in the empire. It's always been the case that certain classes inside the core benefit. Now those classes are mobile. And they are unwilling to allow themselves to be taxed, to pay for infrastructure and the creation of effective demand in our society. So we feel like we are in, what Arianna Huffington bizarrely called Third World America. We feel like that. But in fact, there is a section of this population which is linked to sections of other populations around the world that is doing better than ever. And they are untethered from social commitments. And that's the genius of 21st century imperialism. That it's not necessarily confined by the container of the nation state. There is no nation state for them. There is the nation state for the rest of us. Because we are contained within subsistence levels in our container. And that, I guess, is the tragedy of 21st century imperialism. That was a short course. So meandering from firm to system. We can talk, we have more questions, but after him. Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering.
Yeah.
I remember right after 9/11 how, without question, as you discussed, there was a great deal of anti-Muslim, Hindu, Sikh sentiment, just anti-South Asian sentiment.
Anti-olive skin people things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do remember, though, that from my memory, quite quickly, that Hindus and Sikhs were able to distance themselves more from Muslims, and that the Bush administration really, with the Muslims, kept a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, or at least open anti-Muslim sentiment, to a low. However, around the time that then Senator Obama started to become a big thing running for president, and now anti-Muslim sentiment has increased. And how do you feel that, what kind of role do you feel that President Obama has played for the Muslim American community as well as the South Asian American
It's good to have a Muslim in the White House. Well, look, the thing is that, I don't know, I can't answer you on the merits of the facts there because I don't know the rates of, say, I don't know how we would measure that it was less uncomfortable, and then it gets more uncomfortable when Obama starts running for president. We'll have to look at numbers of attacks and things. I don't know the data there. So let's say I grant you your data, that it goes down after, it peaks, say, up to January 2002, let's make a graph, right? And then it goes down and then Obama says, I'm going to run for president and it starts going up again? Right, okay. Let's say that's the case. Although, I don't know if that's the case, but let's say it's the case. That has a lot to do with, it's an interesting, what the question you're asking me is, why did the Tea Party emerge, in a way? That's the kind of the other side of the question, right?
That was not necessarily my intention.
Oh, okay. But it sounds like I could take it like that. If you let me take it like that, I can have a better answer. because I don't want to interpret data that I don't know if it's true or not, right? So because that's hypothetical for me. I mean, not that I don't trust you, but I'd have to ask you, where did you get the data from? Let's just assume the question is, how did the Tea Party get here? I mean, it's interesting to me that it's a question about this issue of disarticulated production in the United States and such like, and then India. Because my sense, and I've written a little bit about this, precisely because I think India is, as I say in one of the articles, India is at the bottom of the well of this debate. In the 1970s and 1980s up to the mid-1990s, when that great beast arbitrage helped the deindustrialization of, the Wisconsin and Detroit and all these places lost so many factories, including where I work, Hartford, Connecticut. So many factories, mid-level factories, in things along the Connecticut River that made paper, for instance. Paper factories just went bust in this period. Paper production factories, artisanal paper, all went down the tubes. In that period, the layoffs were in industry. And hence you get this evisceration of American unionism, the decline in union membership, you get industrial jobs largely going. And there were protests against NAFTA. When I was in Providence, we participated in anti-NAFTA things. And I think a lot of the union fears about globalization were wrapped into NAFTA. And NAFTA became the big struggle for the kind of declining American unionism. And then that struggle went under the water and emerged at election times, and then now maybe is being reborn in Wisconsin, perhaps. But after the 2000s, in the 2000s, during the time of George Bush, a new dynamic of de-servicization starts in the United States. A new dynamic, which is that you have increased technology, increased, say, computer technology, more secure communication lines, things like that. And you get the ability, therefore, to outsource what they call BPO, business process outsourcing. Much more of that is going to take place in the 2000s. So, for instance, I met a very interesting young woman in Bangalore who does a biochemical research. And what she does is, say, Pfizer, their researchers in Switzerland are blocked in a process they're working on, and there are 3 or 4 different avenues they can go in. So rather than spend money in Switzerland, hiring more researchers to cover the 5 areas they can go in, they find 5 labs in India, and they give each of the labs the research assignment for that piece of the potential project. And so they don't know what they're doing in terms of the totality of the research. They don't know what the other 4, who they are. They just do one piece of the research. And that's high-level research, but because of the different wage rates, it's much cheaper to do it in Bangalore. So these are highly skilled scientists, many of them PhD Purdue, PhD Berkeley, working in Bangalore in these small biochemical research facilities doing business process outsourcing. Then, of course, there are the vast warehouses in China, in India, used to be in Ireland, which would do the secondary level, but not just, hi, you're called 1-800-UNITED and you get somebody in Pune. I don't mean that. I mean they do high level of business processing. They'll, process applications, things like that. And that will go from the big office parks of the Midwest, from Iowa, from Indiana. Those huge office parks built on the outskirts of suburbs will be emptied. And there's a TV show called Outsourced. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's basically that. Big office park closes down, and then this guy is given the option. He becomes a manager in Bangalore. It's a stupid show. But that's exactly the kind of thing they've picked up on. And it's those folk who are typically white, in the heartland, who are mad that their jobs are gone, and not NAFTA for them, but Obama, and India, and terrorism, and those become the core issues. I would say that the base of the Tea Party, and I heard a great paper given by a young woman, Julie Weiss, she argues that in some exurbs of the South, Virginia, etc., it's Latino migrants moving into suburbs and exurbs that fuels some of this anti-immigrant stuff. But in Indiana, in Iowa, Ohio, Indiana, in these states, it's outsourcing. That's a huge issue. So I visited a few Tea Party rallies. Outsourcing is like a huge underexplored issue for that rage. So I don't know if it is anti-Muslim or anything, but it's certainly highly problematic in the vision they have of how international economics works. It's not that the Chinese and the Indians are taking away their jobs. The problem is these uneven hierarchies of economic relations around the planet. The problem is that there's differential wage rates. And what I think is going to happen is in the United States, the subsistence wage is going to go down further. And maybe here it'll go up a little and it'll meet at some point, and then you might get the basis of some global solidarity. But right now, when subsistence rates are higher in one container and lower in another, the workers here will always blame other workers for their jobs going away. And that creates certain kinds of hatred of different people. But I don't think it's about Islam. I think it's focused on these places, Chinese workers, Indian workers, outsourcing, and things like that.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You guys have made me talk about everything. You know, I gave a thing about South Asian American birth and Indian American birth, and yes.
As someone who's very recently moved to America, I've noticed that in the South Asian community, there are basically three kinds of people. One are people who moved here too late in life to really assimilate to American culture, and they're very set in their ways. Second are people who are born here, and so who identify more with American culture than they do with like the traditional South Asian one. And then I guess there are people like me who moved here at a very transitive phase where we have a very strong basis in Indian or Pakistani culture, but we also are open to change. So, I mean, I think for the third kind of people, it's a confusing question, the question of identity. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I mean, these things become confusing. Only certain people feel them to be confusing. You know, here's the thing. You travel back to India now and you go and meet, say, somebody who moved to India from Europe as a child and ask them, what identity problems do you face? And it would be an interesting conversation. Okay, somebody from Belgium, their parents moved to Goa, they grew up in India. Okay, certain people face this question. Who am I? What am I doing here? There are two things in that. One is that it's uneven. Everybody doesn't face the question in the same way. The second is it's also at a certain point in life that anyway the question comes up. You know, if you're a certain age, everybody's asking that question. But then it's magnified by these racial things, by silly questions like when are you going home? You know, then where are you from? And then you say, I'm from blah, blah, blah. And this is a game, right? I'm from Northampton. No, you're not. Where are you from? You know, I tell my students that I'm more American than you because I came here before you were born. So, you know, I've lived here longer than you. So I may talk like somebody that you can laugh at, but I know this country better than you do. So, hello. Okay, but there is a time in life when the question is raised for everybody. You know, everybody asks, you know, who am I? What am I made of? Am I capable? Will I be able to do something in the world? And that, I think, is a general question. And I don't think we should take that as a question of ethnicity alone. I was very frustrated when in Asian American studies there was an obsession for almost 10 years with questions of so-called identity. But what people were not asking is, everybody faces this. This is a common psychological, you know, question that people ask. You know, what am I? Who am I? What am I made of? And then it may get especially racialized. It may get especially ethnic. But why deal with it as a special problem for migrants? I found that to be silly. We don't look at other people, and they are also asking. Everybody's anxious at that point in life. The reason I don't believe in reincarnation, never want to go through my teenage years again. Okay.